secure. Automation and orchestration, endpoint detection and response, network visibility, cloud, containers, DevSecOps, threat intelligence, security platforms. Wondering how to keep up with all the latest security products and trends while still keeping your organization safe? Then stick around to listen to Ready, Set, Secure, the SET Solutions Podcast.
And hello, everybody. How you doing? This is Michael Farnum, Ready, Set, Secure, SET Solutions Podcast, episode 46. Craig, can you believe that? 46.
Definitely getting up there.
We're getting up there. We're getting old. It's almost as old as I am now, as far as just raw number, anyway. Getting close. It's approaching. So, as usual, Mr. Greg Porterfield. How you doing, Greg?
I'm doing well. We're back at it quickly this time.
Yeah, we've only had a week in. Lauren has been trying to get us to get more content, man. So we're like, that summer hiatus, she's just not having it anymore. We got to get back to work. So welcome. Glad you're here. Sorry you couldn't join us in the studio this time. But as usual, Greg gets tied to an IP address because he's got to do real work for our customers. So he deigns to be the co-host. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. All right. Well, good to see you. So joining us today, Mr. Tom Pace. Tom is the co-founder and CEO over at NetRise. How you doing, Tom?
Doing good. Good to see you guys.
Yes, sir. Good to see you. We thought we were going to have Tom down here. He lives up in Austin, and we're just down here in Houston. But he couldn't make it today as he's the CEO. He's a busy man. So we appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, sorry. Just calendar was a bit too insane today to make it happen.
No worries, man. No worries at all. Well, why don't you give us a quick rundown of yourself and of NetRise for all the audience, a couple of minutes, and then we'll get on with the rest of the podcast.
Sure. Yeah. So, as Mike said, I'm the co-founder and CEO of NetRise. I started my career in the United States Marine Corps doing not cybersecurity things. So I was in the infantry, did a bunch of intelligence work, things like that. Then I went on to work in the banking sector for a few years. And then I worked for the Department of Energy at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in New Orleans, where I did industrial control system security, among other things, for a handful of years, which is one of the places where a lot of the inspiration for what we're doing at NetRise happened. Then I left there and worked at Cylance for around 4.5 years doing all manner of things from ICS and IR consulting, the ransomware, incident response. And so now at NetRise, what we are doing is we have built a platform that provides visibility and risk identification to a class of devices that historically has had none. So devices like IoT, ICS, medical devices, embedded systems in vehicles, satellites, telecommunications equipment, which is generally known as XIoT. So we generate an SBOM, find vulnerabilities, correlate those vulnerabilities, help people prioritize the risks, and make recommendations to mitigate and remediate those risks of those devices.
Perfect rundown. I appreciate that. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, kind of focused in on that SBOM side and why it's important in the firmware world and not just all of the software out there, but this is a whole nother world that a lot of people don't cover. So really wanted to talk about that today. So once again, thanks for joining us. We'll dig into that in just a little bit. As usual, at this point, we kind of do a SET Solutions segment. So what we'll kind of repeat, not a whole lot's changed from last week, I don't think. We've got a couple of Black Hat dinners. We will be at Black Hat and at DEF CON as well. Greg, I think you're going to DEF CON only, or are you going to both?
I'll be at both.
Okay, awesome. So if you, we're thinking about trying to figure out some stuff to record while we're there. So we're going to try to generate some content in our Black Hat suite while we're there. And then if, Greg wants to record some crazy stuff from DEF CON, we can do that as well. That's always fun, but we'll be at both of those. We have a couple of dinners going on that week, believe on Tuesday and Thursday, or Tuesday and Wednesday. Get with your SET Solutions account rep if you don't have invites for that, but we'll be there for that. And then coming up after Black Hat and DEF CON, we've got some executive wine dinners going on later in August, maybe even September. But both of those there'll be one in Houston and one in Dallas. If you don't have an invite to that, please get with your account rep and let them know. Those are always good events, a lot of fun, a lot of good wine if you like wine. So, and if you just like our company, you can come to that if you don't like wine. So that is it for the Set Solutions segment. Now we'll jump into the news segment. So we got 3 articles this time. Sometimes we do 2, sometimes we do 3. Tom gave us a good article as well. So the first one is going to be by me, or it's not by me. I'm reading it from an article. I did not write this. It's talking about how some of the malware delivery has changed because now that macros are shut down. In the Microsoft world, the post-macro world is what they're calling it. They're already seeing some changes in how they're delivering some malware, and there's some interesting components to why they're doing that, specifically on how Microsoft treats some of these external files. So we'll talk about that. Then Greg is going to be talking about Lockbit ransomware is abusing Windows Defender to load Cobalt Strike, another one of those good guy tools used for bad purposes, which is pretty typical. And then Tom is going to be talking about the DHS releasing their cybersecurity requirements for critical pipeline owners and operators. We've got a few customers that need to know about that. So I think that's going to be a good rundown. So let me start with mine, and then we'll go into the rest of them. So talking about the post-macro world. So if you haven't kept up with this is something, I know Greg has lived this world and Tom as well. There's been macro support for the longest time. That was the kind of the Microsoft way of doing things and putting macros so you could do all kinds of fun and fancy things in Excel and other pieces of their software, their Office suite. And people have been griping about that for a long time to take the support away for macros, because that was a really easy way of delivering malware into different environments. So they finally shut that down, some of that support, or a lot of that support down. I think it's basically, you can use it if you want to, but it's off by default. And if you still have a lot of functionality that you need to have that's dependent on macros, then you can turn that back on. But I think a lot of people, would be surprised how much is still there that is supported or is needed by macros. But companies these days that don't need it, maybe new companies that have never been reliant on macros, or people who just want to get rid of it, they are shutting that down, so it won't be on by default. So, and what we're seeing is a couple of companies are showing that a lot of the malware delivery has flipped over to like containerized files, so like an ISO or something like that. So they try to get you to think that that's a calendar invite or whatever social engineering they need to do. You pull that down. The reason that's effective, if you can get it past that and get it into your environment, is because once that loads up in a containerized type of environment on your machine, you don't have that whole warning that, hey, this comes from the internet, because it's running locally on your machine. So you don't get that warning pop up. So that's one less thing for somebody to go, oh, no, I really don't want to run that. So that's essentially why it's effective. It's still, what is it called? The mark of the web is what it's called. Yeah. So, so if that attribute is not set to tag that file, then you won't get that warning. It's still going to require, some finagling, because people are used to EXE, are used to docs and Excels and that kind of thing. Maybe, hopefully, they see some of these weird file extensions and they're like, I don't know about that. So they won't load it. But they're definitely, I think it was Proof Point is saying that they're seeing a shift in how that's done. So, Greg, as a pen tester, what's your take on that?
I think the macro thing it's been interesting to watch for the last couple of months. The kind of initial Microsoft came out and said, hey, we're getting rid of these. Defensive and offensive testers alike kind of rejoiced. It's kind of good and bad. It's a very effective technique, but it's also very effective for attackers. So getting rid of macros was a good idea. And it remains a good idea. Then I think it was last month, Microsoft kind of pushed back or pulled back a little bit, and they stopped the rollout of the process. And they have since re-engaged, as far as I've been able to understand. Of it was a little bit of, I think, tuning. I think there are too many environments out there that, whether it's legacy thing or people, didn't build or buy software, but they built these elaborate macros in Word documents or Excel sheets or whatever that are still business critical. And it was causing some problems. So they were trying to figure out a way to go around that. Sounds like they're there. The escalation or change of tactics isn't all that surprising. The first step is always going to be the hardest, of how do you get into an environment, and anything that can be abused is likely going to be. With the advancement of Windows Subsystem for Linux and virtualization becoming more popular and more common on endpoints and things like that, I think we'll probably continue to see things like this show up. And it's going to make it complicated to find, but it is findable. So,
Tom, what you come from Cylance? I know you saw a lot of this stuff going back and forth in environments. What's your thought?
I mean, generally, I view a lot of this stuff from a defensive position, and so from that perspective, it's pretty hard to not be happy about it. Also, to Greg's point, it seems to me to just really be a legacy feature that can be solved in a lot of other more effective ways. I certainly can imagine that certain organizations might be still relying on macros, but I think that's the problem. We have the technology now to use other things than Microsoft Excel for everything. We actually have I have a make-believe policy here at NetRise that if you send me something in a spreadsheet and I can find a piece of software that can do it for me in under 5 minutes, then that's going to be a problem. A spreadsheet doesn't need to be like asset inventory and ticketing and support and everything. We have other pieces of software that do those things.
We have the technology. Good old $6 million man reference.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, generally speaking, I'm pretty happy about the disabling of macros, and I think it should probably be a good thing for most organizations overall.
There's so much technical debt that people have dependencies out there, and nobody wants to come up with another solution, to your point. So, and it's like, oh, we've been doing this for years. This is the way we do it. Let's keep doing it this way. But it's, I get it. There's cost to everything. So, all right. Well, let's jump over to Greg. So Lockbit ransomware abuses Windows Defender to load Cobalt Strike. Set us up, Greg.
So this article caught my attention. Mostly because it's kind of ironic, and it's really just kind of amusing of kind of playing into it, or just talking about anything that can be abused will be. In this case, we're seeing, well, not we, but Sentinel Labs noticed during a Lockbit ransomware attack that the attackers were using what amounts to Microsoft Defender to sideload malicious DLLs. And this was unfortunate, but it happens. Everything that executes code can probably be abused. It's a matter of time before someone finds something. Initially, the vectors were things like log4j or whatever, but it's still that kind of first point of entry. As Defender gets more common and better at showing up, it's going to be the vector, or it's going to be a vector that can be used. It's not the first time that something about Defender has been found that made attackers' lives better, but they get patched and we move on. In the case that we were seeing here, this Defender command line is being used to decrypt encrypted files and ultimately get Cobalt Strike beacons installed. And it's I have some respect for it. It's unfortunate, but it's a neat process. It's an old technique, but one that is still effective and will probably continue to be effective going forward. And it keeps drawing attention to understanding what normal looks like. This is the kind of attack that is going to be difficult to find from a Defender's point of view unless you know what normal looks like. If Defender's not used in your environment and this starts showing up in the logs, that's a really big problem. It can be sitting latent or anything like that, but it's just knowing your environment, paying attention to small indicators, and kind of moving forward with them. Attacks are going to keep happening.
Tom, again, Cylance background, man. You've seen this stuff. PowerShell for days.
Yeah, I think the problem here is, I think Greg touched on it a bit, is kind of the ubiquitous nature of Windows Defender. And I know it seems like we still have lots of companies that are maybe even keeping both. Say they have, a Cylance Protect or, SentinelOne or CrowdStrike or something like that. We've seen plenty of companies that still keep Defender around, I guess, kind of like a belt and suspenders approach, or maybe they'll have Defender for different types of assets in their environment. Like maybe they'll use that for the servers and use something else for workstations and things like that. The other thing I think that was interesting is definitely having that awareness of what is being used where is really important. That way, whenever something like this does kind of come up, you can have better visibility to it. But we did a ton of Cobalt Strike beacon research and analysis at Cylance, and it seems like there's basically an infinite number of ways to be creative with these things. But as Microsoft continues to gain really fast and broad security market share, I think that these things are going to become more and more common, or more and more like juicy targets, because of how it's built into the operating system. Mm-hmm. So there's just other advantages that you have. Like if you go after like an installed piece of software, that's great, especially if it has like kernel level access. But there's always going to be other things that you're probably going to be able to do with something like Windows Defender that's much more ingrained into the operating system. So fun times ahead.
Yeah, ton of hooks that are natively built in. This is not like they went and bought a tool and did this. Exactly. They designed this from the ground up. So native, I mean, the PowerShell that's built, I mean, it's all of it. It's you've got all these native tools that are supposed to be used for the right thing. And that's every EDR vendor I've ever seen shows that's the primary use case is the PowerShell command. Is it doing something weird? And that's the whole thing. It's like, is it doing something weird? So now we've got to have more content to show whether something that's using another legitimate tool is doing something that is outside the norm. It's it's frustrating, but you're right. I mean, we see a ton of customers that are going to Defender, and a lot of them already have the licensing for it and do it. I'll say it again, I get a little weird and everything else using a company's tools to defend the very problems that they created in the first place. But, sometimes I get in trouble for saying those things. So forget I said it. Anyway, forgot. Strike it from the record, Warren, please. Do not create a transcript of that part.
There's also a balance to trying to help. Defender it has grown up a lot over the years. They continue to improve it. They continue to improve its visibility. And because it's ingrained, there are certain elements of it that are harder to get around. Turning off like a CrowdStrike or another thing that gets installed, it was installed, therefore it can be uninstalled. Defender's a little bit harder to get rid of, group policy and various other things. But there's something about we still haven't figured out a good way to get around this, but there's no one solution to it. It's not a Defender problem so much as it's one vector. So you have to have that belt and suspenders and another belt and suspenders covering every different point, because if an endpoint is compromised, you still have to deal with that more or less eventuality. And how do we keep the rest of the network safe when one endpoint is compromised, and keep going outward from there?
So belt and suspenders is a new term for defense in depth. Is that?
Yeah.
Like you can't say defense in depth anymore either, right? It's zero trust. Nothing stress anything. Anyway, there's a whole lot to that. We could talk about that forever. I say that on every podcast. We could talk about that for 2 more hours, but we do have to move on. So, Mr. Pace, DHS releases cybersecurity requirements for critical pipeline owners, operators. This is going to be extremely important to many of our customers being in Houston, and this world. So tell us I think it's obvious what brought this to the forefront of your mind, but just talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I picked this is maybe not, it isn't super logical, I suppose, but I picked it because I typically am a pretty big fan of the government not being involved in these kind of decision-making processes. I tend to find those not usually there's just not teeth to them a lot of times. And it's just like somebody writes it on a piece of paper and then they're like, yeah, we did this thing and nothing ever happens. But that seems to be changing in a pretty significant way in a positive direction. So if you look at what happened with the NTIA, establishing all the SBOM standards and all that kind of fun stuff that we're going to talk about, and then a lot of that now being moved over to CISA for actual practical implementation of those, that's actual progress that's happening. These things ended up in the executive orders, very prescriptive sets of steps were put out there. And some of those steps are outrageous, hey, you should use multi-factor authentication. But if you don't say it and force it, people won't do it. And so there's a few things in here that I thought were really good, and this is the second big kind of directive that TSA put out. I mean, there was a lot of headlines when they put out their first one about reporting requirements around incidents that affect gas and pipeline operators due to obviously the critical nature of the business that they do. Having worked at Department of Energy and had some, I guess, what you would call enhanced visibility to things. I think I'm too far in the forest to see the trees to provide a totally biased opinion, but I'm generally of the opinion of we probably shouldn't tell the public when the critical infrastructure environment that they all rely on might have a problem. You have a problem with
have you seen that show? Was it, or that movie, Don't Look Up? I think it was.
I have not seen it, but I totally understand the premise of what's going on. Yes, exactly. When people potentially lose confidence in the security of their local water treatment facility, that's probably not good. So putting some of these things out about putting technology in place around protecting against ransomware attacks, getting visibility, conducting cybersecurity architecture reviews, having contingency and recovery plans, all those things should be table stakes. We know that they are not table stakes. And you run into some pretty interesting problems here because a lot of times these entities and organizations, they're not like an enterprise. Their goal is not to make money necessarily. Mm-hmm. Their goal is to get gas and other materials from this location to this location to generally serve the public good. Now, someone's making money, don't get me wrong. But that's not the goal of the institution, generally speaking. And it seems like CISA is taking a much more active role in supporting and funding and even providing actual human capital resources to these organizations. And that's great. Those are real practical steps in the right direction. So I thought that was great. And it's just exciting to just generally see all of the OT and ICS stuff that's going on. I mean, the leaps and bounds that have occurred since even I left Department of Energy are pretty impressive. So that's what I want to talk about.
It really is. The growth is, and the differences in the enforcement and the teeth to it have changed dramatically. I'm the same way as you. I'm typically fairly libertarian type of person. Government can keep out of my business, but I think critical infrastructure falls well within their purview of making sure things don't blow up, and I can still fill my car up, and I can still cool my house these days, not heat. But yeah, a lot of the stuff that they're doing, but you're right. But all of those regulations tend to get pushed through. I mean, coming from healthcare in the day when I've done HIPAA, it had zero teeth to it, nothing at all. I would use my bully pulpit a little bit as being the guy who had to get things done for HIPAA. And then finally the CFO was like, but nobody's getting any fines or getting anything enforced. Why should I keep doing this? And I couldn't argue. So the fact that they're doing this in this way and doing it in there are some things that come down that it's like, can you give us a little more than 30 days to get this knocked out? I'd appreciate it, type of thing.
Yeah.
But
they are definitely unreasonable when it comes to their timeframes, I think, most of the time. And I think that's just due to a zero experience in like reality. That's like the problem with how, just the government in general, when their edicts from on high, it's like they don't even know what they have, and you want them to do like a architecture review. Okay. Probably not going to happen. But
Greg,
I think part of it, because I deal with the other side of CISA and their what they put out, the notifications and the language that they're able to use to let people know, hey, there's a problem that's going on. It's kind of like a short list of what's going on in terms of vulnerabilities and new things. And most of that stuff is pretty actionable. I've often questioned the timelines, because some of them are like, you must patch this by the end of next week, which is awesome. And I would usually agree. And there's others where they're like, you need to patch this sometime before the end of the year or next year. Like, they have these really odd windows for things. And there was just an article, probably came off Twitter, that was talking about attackers or ransomware groups. Basically, your kind of bad actors are getting faster and faster at latching onto vulnerabilities. It's now a matter of minutes from something being published to a scanner starts sweeping the web for things. So while the timelines may seem unreasonable for some elements of get this stuff patched or this has to be fixed, it may also be a response to things are moving quicker. We don't have a month to patch things anymore. We have to be able to respond within minutes or hours. But it is I like the direction, mostly because too many organizations need the stick because the carrot won't work to get them to secure and lock things down. So if a stick is what was required, then here comes regulation. I don't like it, but I think it's probably useful.
Well, I mean, to be fair, if I give you 90 days to do something, if you're one of these groups, you're probably going to wait till like the last 5 days anyway. But
probably
patching and getting things done on a quicker cadence and is one thing. Telling everybody to get rid of all of their admin credentials on their workstations and really short, that's a whole nother thing. It's just not realistic. So it's those are things that. But again, when you get more and more, which we've seen, more and more people involved in like CISA and those that actually have real world experience, hopefully the better that will be. And I'm generally, again, not a fan of like executive action and having things that aren't done legislatively. But at the same time, if you're going to have any kind of movement on this stuff, legislature, you got a bunch of senators and Congress people who are just going to like talk about it for 5 weeks so they can get on the record of having, their stuff on the record saying how important cybersecurity is to them. So I'm generally in agreement with it going this way. Again, hopefully there's no black helicopters starting to fly outside to come pick me up between them and Microsoft. I'm pissing a bunch of people off today. Anyway,
they can come for me.
Yeah. So Tom, let's just use this to go right into what we wanted to talk about, because I think there's get a bit of a segue here because of what you've done in your background and what you're doing at NetRise. So I talk a lot about supply chain attacks and talk a lot about SBOMs in general and how important like software composition analysis tools are for typical software, web applications, that kind of stuff. But and I think, and I literally talked about it today on a webinar that I did earlier today with an API company, 42 Crunch. Talked about them a little bit, and we talked about software composition analysis. But you're talking about something that a developer has put together that, in our world, we've come to a fairly good place that how that's built, and you can break that down fairly easily, and somebody's got some kind of record of it. in your world, where it's the firmware side of things, where you're trying to get a bill of materials, that's a whole nother animal. When I got introduced to NetRise, I hadn't really thought this all the way through. I know there's a lot of network devices and things like that need this, that people don't think about. Give us a rundown of kind of why you came to that conclusion with NetRise, at some of that Department of Energy background that you and I have talked about, and let's dig into the problem of software bill of materials on the firmware side of things.
Yeah, so there's a handful of experiences that kind of motivated and drove what we're doing here. So the first one was, while I was at DOE, one of the things that I was tasked with was determining the impact of vulnerabilities and risks associated with those devices, of which we had many, obviously. The problem is, what I very quickly realized was we had no technical capability that could give me like that visibility into like where these software components were on all of these crazy devices. Like we didn't have tenable agents installed on all of our industrial control systems, or all of our telecommunications infrastructure, or all of our security cameras and badge card readers and printers, and all of this other like stuff, or what somebody with a very creative name called things, the Internet of Things. So it's a very helpful description. So the real only course of action that I had at the time was doing manual analysis, which is unbelievably unscalable, and reaching out to the manufacturers. Some manufacturers could give good answers. Most really couldn't, especially, back then. Some of that's for really good reasons, and some of it's not for good reasons. Most manufacturers have the exact same problem as the end user of that device. They are dealing with third-party supply chain risks like everybody else. So if you look at, factory automation vendors who might be using like Wind River, things like that, that they need to deal with a manufacturer in the same kind of vein. So no one has like a totally vertically aligned supply chain, unfortunately. And then when I got to Cylance, I oversaw a lot of our like IoT, firmware, and embedded system engagements, and we were doing work with many incredibly large device manufacturers like Fortune 10. So that gave us some really good perspective and visibility into the problems that these different organizations had, and it also showed us that we couldn't hire enough people to do the work. And that is a very unique set of skills, because you have to be a really good pen tester, a really good reverse engineer. You have to really understand like network protocols and things like, so it's, you have to be like this unicorn to just do a consulting engagement, which is not what a lot of those people want to do, frankly. If you're like a great reverse engineer, no offense to great reverse engineers who like to talk to people, but a lot of them don't like to talk to people. That's just the reality of it, right? Yeah. They like to talk to computers in code. And we got a bunch of those guys here, and they're amazing. And I don't want them talking to people. I want them to keep reverse engineering.
That's your job.
I talk to people. That's what I do. And I'm not reverse engineering anything, which will be the primary reason this company is successful. So taking all of that, like seeing that we were just like leaving these deals on the table, and then people were asking questions like, okay, great. You found this vulnerability, this risk, this expired certificate, these weak credentials. Like, can you tell me where else this is? And the obvious answer to that question at the time was no, because we weren't centrally aggregating all your firmware, continuously monitoring for, software components, correlating those with vulnerabilities. So all we were giving people was like a snapshot in time PDF report, which is all that was really available in the market at that time. But like 90 days later, that report is, you don't want to call it useless, but kind of. And they would only do it once, and then they'd bring a product to market, and that was it. So it was confusing to me why we didn't think it was necessary to apply the same basic security principles to a set of devices that we literally call critical, and not do basic things. Like, are there vulnerabilities in this? Well, I don't know. Well, what do you mean you don't know? That thing is responsible for pumping billions of dollars of oil here or there. Or like, what about this thing that is responsible for building the products that this company sells? Can you tell me if it has this risk or issue? Well, I don't know. Well, but you can tell me what processes are running on Tom in accounting's laptop right now. And it's like, yeah, like that paradigm was like very confusing to me. Now, I think the reason is it's a really hard problem. And firmware is so heterogeneous. You're dealing with so many different formats and compression algorithms and proprietary stuff all over the place, different programming languages and processor architectures, all that stuff. And that's all true. But that just makes it hard. It doesn't make it impossible. And so there's really good ways to kind of generalize that problem set, which we've done. And automation and scalability are essential, which we've already solved those problems. So yeah, that was a bit of the, inspiration and motivation for how we got here. You're exactly right. We literally chose the hardest approach to this problem imaginable, which is going after compiled code in firmware. So the assumption we were making is that we don't have the source and we're not working with the device manufacturer, right? Because even if you don't have the source, the device manufacturer can like tell you what things is most of the time, or at least give you a better inkling, because you end up dealing with like backported code, which is a huge nightmare in this space, and a bunch of other just random proprietary things that people do. But going about it that way allowed us to, number one, solve some really hard problems at the beginning, and also allowed us to target the enterprise market. So not only the people building the devices, but the people using the devices as well. So the use cases are a bit different, but generally speaking, the platform serves them both equally.
Yeah, there's a couple of different takes on that I want to talk about, and I want to get Greg's input on this as well because of his background and what he does for a living over here. Let me get them both out of my head before I forget both of them if I haven't already. So one of them is once you know that kind of thing, and we had this exact discussion I think yesterday when we were doing a deeper dive into your stuff with some of our team yesterday, Tom, was in that kind of environment. Once you know about it, what can you do about it? That's kind of the first thing I want to talk about. And then the second one is, and I need Greg's input here to help me out from a development background, because I've got AppSec background, but I don't have development background. What I see a lot, and when we broke down traditional applications, is that a lot of time you'll have legacy code, or you've got some components in there that used to be used that aren't used anymore, but get stuck in there. So even if there's a vulnerability in them, it doesn't necessarily mean it affects anything because it's not all necessarily part of the data flow through the application itself. It could just be kind of a, an orphan type of component that doesn't get used. But in my very limited understanding of firmware, that doesn't happen as much because the components you're putting in there are going to be used for something because they've got very distinct functionality that they're doing, and you don't tend to get orphan components as much. And let's take that last one first. Am I correct there, or do you know that, Greg? Or
I'll let Greg go.
I would think that the software to firmware development is kind of a different beast. I didn't do firmware. I was always on the software side, just like I didn't do hardware, because there is a pretty substantial difference. Software or code bloat, code inefficiencies can be tolerated in certain places. But once you start getting into hardware and kind of low-level stuff, those tolerances start shrinking pretty dramatically. Code has to be usable because they're trying to get it as small as possible, because the larger the code, the larger things it has to sit on. I imagine that's gotten easier over the years, but it's still space. And they have to be fairly fast. Software is easy to patch. Firmware is harder. It's harder to get people to do software patches, let alone the things that actually interrupt computers and things like this. So I would think there's probably less bits of code that isn't used, but it wouldn't surprise me to find it. So Tom?
Yeah, I think that's right. So whenever we break down firmware into essentially 3 different broad like operating system types, essentially. So you have embedded Linux, then you have real-time operating systems, which are typically stuff like on PLCs, like very very specific, use cases that are occurring there. A lot of times it's just a single ELF binary. That's it. And then a bunch of other stuff happens when you run it. And then you have Windows firmware. And then I guess you could even have like bare metal firmware as well. So you'd be surprised, I think, in terms of the embedded Linux firmware, we see, astonishing numbers of components that are not being used. So what a lot of companies do is they'll take think about it like a gold image for whatever, for like a switch, or even in the automotive industry, you'll see this. Or they'll have like a ECU, like electronic control unit firmware base image, and then they'll build on that with like different modules and different whatever.
Yeah.
And so you end up getting a ton of stuff that's in there in vulnerabilities that can be identified, but might not be able to be exploitable in the utilization of that device. That's like the holy grail problem, by the way. Identifying components, finding the vulnerabilities, validating that the vulnerability is in fact in there, and then is there an exploit? And then is it exploitable in the context of the device if the vulnerability has been validated?
And that's why I asked the question, right? Because sometimes even if that component's in there, I know in software, I was trying to gauge the difference between those two. Because I know like working on old routers, like old Juniper routers, they were all just Linux code. And that was that when you update, but then you had Cisco that wasn't, it was its own iOS, completely different animal. So when you're going in there and seeing with the development process and seeing the components that are in each, there could be a crap ton of stuff in the Juniper stuff, but maybe not as much bloat on the Cisco side is what, again, anecdotal, right? I don't have the background there to know that.
It just creates a different problem. So very familiar with both of those. Like Cisco has an extraordinary number of proprietary components.
Yeah.
So the problem you run into in that scenario is, how are you identifying these components? What are you identifying them against? It's not like I can't pick up the phone and be like, hey, Cisco, we identified these 10 open source components, but we need help identifying these 200 that are Cisco components. Can
I get access to your repository, please?
You guys mind sending over your Artifactory real quick? And so it's just like a different set of problems. And it's like, how can I possibly, this is where like emulation doesn't even get you there. Because how can I possibly understand like every use case of how a device could be used when I have the firmware? Like maybe if you have to have this kind of module plugged into the back of the switch for that code to be used. Well, how do I know if they have that? Like there's just too many facts. I hate saying things are impossible problems, but that's pretty close to one. And it's just like, could you do it? Sure. Can you do it at scale, automated for like every possible like use case and like module that could potentially be involved? Like it's probably gonna take some time.
Yeah.
So I do make that statement a lot whenever folks say to me, well, yeah, that component's not even being used in this device. And then I just pause. I don't even give an answer because I wait for them to just come around on their own.
Think about it.
Think about it.
Gears turning. Yeah.
Take your time. And then they go, I know you're going to tell me it shouldn't be in there. That's right. I am going to tell you it shouldn't be. So, it's like, it's interesting to me that like, it's my responsibility to understand if your software should be on this device. That doesn't make sense to me, but we'll do our best, frankly, right? Because you do have scenarios, right? Like this is not all like these folks, like I hate saying fault. It's not like, But like maybe there was an acquisition, and I mean, we've heard stories of people losing source code, but they still have to support this product line, and like there's all kinds of crazy scenarios that can exist here that make this problematic. But generally speaking, it's like the analogy I've used a million times is imagine you have a severe peanut allergy, and you walk into a bakery, and you're like, I would like this cake, and I have a severe peanut allergy. Are there any peanuts in this cake? And the baker looking at you and going, I have no idea. It's like, you made it. You made the cake. And it's
you
like,
should know. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you should have at least an idea. So
guys, Lauren's going to shoot me because we're 45 minutes into this thing. So I hate to be abrupt, but we do need to, because she's got to do post-production work, and she's going to come at me when I go down the hall. So we're going to go ahead and cut it off. Tom, we want to have you back. Absolutely want to have you back. We're going to see you hopefully at Black Hat next week. We can connect there. Y'all got a booth at Black Hat?
We do. Yeah. We're the Innovation City. As a startup, you get to be in the Innovation City for a couple of years, which is pretty cool. Awesome. So we're excited about that. Yeah. We're having a dinner on Wednesday, meeting up with a bunch of folks and clients and partners like yourselves. So really excited. It's got kind of our coming out party this year. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Everybody go see them. Go meet Tom. We're really excited, especially with our customers, that customer types that we have to do more stuff. I think we've got a potential deal going on right now where some people saw some value. They saw you at RSA, and then we're all connecting. So we're getting some activity over here. Definitely a needed thing in the world. I want to talk about next time what you do about it. So let's have that conversation next time. Let's make that, because we could, again, I'm going to say it, we could talk about that for hours by itself. So anyway, Tom, thank you very much. NetRise.io, right? That's
you got it.
Where to go.
Yes,
NetRise.io. Go see them at Black Hat. Thank you, sir.
No problem. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Greg, any parting words?
Not this time.
Wisdom?
Come see us at Black Hat.
Come see us at Black Hat. Come see us at DEF CON. We have suites there. We're going to have a good time, and we're going to hopefully learn some stuff. Everybody, thanks for being here for episode 46. We will see you on episode 47 very soon. Talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.